Sepultura has announced their farewell tour and retirement. So you know what it's finally time to do?
Speak a little truth and people lose their minds.
Yes, we are finally ranking the Sepultura discography, and we're starting right from the top with Morbid Visions in 1986. Some fun trivia if you didn't know, aside from the rough production, Max has said they didn't even fully tune their guitars and they knew very little English, so lyrics were translated word for word. Definitely makes for a pretty charming debut from a couple of Brazilian dudes who were clearly inspired by the more satanic vibes of Slayer at this point. I can also hear how, along with the likes of Celtic Frost, Bathory, and Venom, this was also a starting point for some of the earliest black metal bands. There's even a track called Mayhem. It's got a unique, cavernous atmosphere that allows it to stand out from all the other albums here, and as someone who digs that, I'd say its shortcomings end up becoming a big strength. So it's actually one of my favorites. I'm putting it up at fantastic. They followed that up with Schizophrenia in 1987. Now this feels like what they really wanted out of Morbid Visions. It's all that same aggression, but with better production and tighter performances, and also the first album with Andreas Kisser on guitar. From the Past Comes the Storms is pure Slayer, and you can hear the impact that Rain and Blood likely had on them, having come out just a year before. Septic Schizo is a rager, and I also hear some of that Celtic Frost still coming through on tracks like To the Wall and Escape to the Void. And then we get that great acoustic intro to the spooky, atmospheric Inquisition Symphony. This got them signed to Roadrunner Records, and frankly, I think it's extremely underrated. It's perfection for me. Like, just great album. I think the next two get a lot of credit, and this one not as much, but honestly, it's probably my favorite of those three. But speaking of which, we gotta move on to Beneath the Remains in 1989. Alright, so hear me out. For years, I have called this album overrated.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
But I've come back to it many times over the years, and I think it's finally starting to grow on me. They're definitely working on expanding the dynamics and atmosphere, though at the loss of some of the bloodlust and grit I love about the first two albums. It's also clear that they drank from the Master of Puppets Kool-Aid going into this one, which is especially evident on Sarcastic Existence. In any case, the title track absolutely slaps, Riff City, Inner Self still bringing some of that Celtic Frost energy, Stronger Than Hate is a banger, Mass Hypnosis has great soloing. More fun trivia, the original cover art was actually supposed to be the one that ended up on Obituary's Cause of Death. I can totally get why people love this, and it is definitely one of their better albums, so I am also going to put this one at perfection.
I can admit when I'm wrong.
They followed that up with Arise in 1991. Continuing in a similar vein here, the opener has a great hook and fulfills the old promise of speed, and that transition to the slower part on Dead Embryonic Cells is everything. Desperate Cry also has some really infectious groove amidst the skanky beats, and I love the bass break on the kind of Metallica-esque Subtraction. Under Siege bringing some mild industrial vibes, Meaningless Movements delivering the hooks, and the intro to Altered State with the more tribal drumming feels like a teaser of their more regional influences to come. It took me a while to get into this one too, for whatever reason, and I think I like Beneath slightly more, but it does only get better with each listen. This was also their first album to hit Billboard charts and was also voted the favorite right here on the channel community tab. So some people are probably going to be mad. I'm going to put it at fantastic, not perfection. But come on, like, if you're upset about that, chill the fuck out. It's only going to get worse from here, trust me. Next up is Chaos AD in 1993.
Chaos AD, takes on the streets, controlling police, bleeding the flame.
Okay, so they make a pretty distinct shift from thrash to groove on this record, which I'm fine with, but I do have to say, something about Max's delivery on Refuse Resist makes me snicker every time I listen to it. Like, I'm surprised this track hasn't made a resurgent, because it really is like AI made a metal song out of 2020's hashtags, but I found it to be silly long before Twitter even existed. That said, this re-listen, I enjoy this album a whole lot more than I did back in the day, because this is another one I resisted. I don't know why, it just like didn't click with me. I find some of it to be a little bit corny, but I love these guitar grooves that they're leaning heavily into the tribal drumming style, both integrated on the kit and starting the trend of including standalone tribal instrumentals with Kairos. Then I hear a lot of Helmet influence on the guitars, especially on tracks like Amen. Territory is pretty dope. Slave New World, Nomad, and Amen have a little industrial flair again to them. Propaganda has a banger bass part. So yeah, overall, another one, I'm going to put this at fantastic. I think it's really strong. I do appreciate that this is where they really start sounding like a unique band too, like really waving the flag for their Brazilian roots. But speaking of which, there's another album I think does this even better.
You wouldn't. You just couldn't.
Yes, this is Roots in 1996. I am a diehard Roots apologist.
Unsubscribe.
There is a sect of the fan base that hates this album, but again, I love how much reverence this has for the band's Brazilian roots, and as a big Soulfly fan, this is clearly a big jumping off point for that sound. It was deeply inspired by a visit with the indigenous Zavante tribe, who were also recorded for the album. And then you've got some awesome guest appearances here from Jonathan Davis of Korn and Mike Patton on Look Away. Roots Bloody Roots is an absolute banger, as is Cutthroat, Breed Apart, and Born Stubborn. Attitude is like tribal meets industrial meets groove. Rada Mahada killing it with those drums and the tribal singing. Does it need to be an hour and 12 minutes? Probably not, but there's not really any songs I would be quick to cut either. You could probably swap Jasko for Ambush and then just end on It's Sorry, and to be fair, over 13 minutes of the runtime is more or less a bonus track. If you're one of those lame, never new metal people, you're gonna hate it, but I think those people are missing out, and they're allergic to fun. So yeah, get pissed off all you want. This shit's going to perfection, right after Schizophrenia, above Beneath the Remains. Choke on it.
Things you wouldn't understand. Things you couldn't understand.
Of course, Max would leave after this album to further explore these sounds with Soulfly, which brings us to Against in 1998.
Crashing back and forth, never really stopping.
So Max is out, replaced by Derek Green, and honestly, he slides right in pretty well. Their vocals aren't all that dissimilar on this album. Musically, this continues on in a similar train as Roots, but I feel like it lacks the same punch. Lots of great drumming still, but the riffs feel very generic and recycled, and as a result, I don't find many of these tracks to be sticking with me. Also, around Floaters in Mud, we start to get some questionable vocal choices, despite that being an otherwise decent track. Unconscious and Kamaitachi have some cool atmosphere. Like, it's not bad, it just feels like Roots light. It's pretty forgettable. I'm gonna put this one at okay tier. I think even their worst albums are like a C+ though. Like, their discography is relatively consistent in quality, if not at all in particular style. Next up is Nation in 2001. This album was better reviewed than Against, but apparently sold even less. To me, though, it just doesn't feel like much has changed. More great drumming in service of pretty unimaginative songwriting. And if you ask me, Soulfly were absolutely bodying Sepultura at this point with the same style. As always, by all means, comment below if you do disagree and why. I'm always interested in hearing perspectives outside of my own. This is all subjective. And by the way, if you're enjoying the video, hit the like button. If you hate it, hit the dislike button. I don't care.
The hate only makes me stronger.
Anyways, Umakura is kind of fun. The second half, I would say, is much stronger than the first. Some cool guest spots here from Jello Biafra of Dead Kennedys and Jamie Josta of Hatebreed. I like the song Reject, but ultimately this one is also going to just okay for me. Then we got Roorback in 2003. Come Back Alive is a much better opener than the last two had, feeling some of that old energy coming back here. Godless and Apes of God also bring some real fire both in the riffs and Derek's screams. Urge shows improved dynamics and melodic elements alongside the heavy stuff. Corrupted is a foot tapper. Leech has a lot of fun hardcore energy. It's hardly reinventing the wheel, but I think that this is the first album since Max left that comes quite close to being as strong as his final outing with the band. So I saw some people rating this low. It's pretty low rated on Metal Storm, but I put it at great tier. Like, I think it's like just under Chaos AD. Then we have Dante XXI in 2006.
What you want is what you learn. It never made a difference to you.
As the name might imply, this is a concept based on the Divine Comedy, and it's also the last with Igor on drums. Dark Wood of Error kicks off with almost a Meshuggah-style riff that really does give off the vibe that we are tunneling down to hell with Dante and Virgil. Great balance of atmosphere and aggression. It feels a lot darker than the last few albums, and the first in a while that feels like any sort of stylistic progression or experimentation. Loving the eerie strings on the interludes that break up the three acts. Love the drum break on repeating the horror. Crown and Mitre is a D-beat rager with some subtle brass additions. Big dramatic closer with more strings and sitar. For me, this is where the Derek era really starts to find its stride with their own interesting take on the band's sound. And so this one was at great. It got bumped down a little bit. I'm putting it at good, but like pretty high up there. Then we got A-Lex or A-Lex in 2009. So that experimentation continues with another concept album, this one based on A Clockwork Orange.
I've taught you much, my little droogies.
I'm not in love with how this album starts with Moloko Mesto feeling a little half-baked, but from there, things get really interesting. I love how hard Filthy Rot goes with the kind of Fear Factory vibe and sick backup vocals, but then we've also got a few tracks on the slower side, like the sludgy We've Lost You and some pretty outright doomy interludes. What I Do and Enough Said have some more Celtic Frost sounding riffs coming back. Sadistic Values is full-on atmosphere with clean, plodding guitars over a rolling snare drum, slowly evolving into another more genty sounding riff. Ludwig van incorporates classical music fitting to the concept. Really every track has this very imposing atmosphere and is several steps darker even from the previous album. I feel like they only get more interesting the more they venture away from roots. In a way, it goes back to the more blackened aesthetic of the early stuff, just not in a thrash style. This is much more kind of grand, symphonic, progressive. I really think it's amazing. I'm going to put it at great tier, pretty high up at that. Then we have Kairos in 2011. This is their first album with Nuclear Blast and produced by Ross Robinson, and it sounds great, but honestly it feels like a step back from a songwriting standpoint. Getting right into it with the head bob-inducing groove of Spectrum, the cover of Just One Fix from Ministry is pretty cool, but feels weird so early in the track listing. The Firestarter cover is a nice twist too. Dialogue is also pretty rad. Overall, solid tracks, but just nothing super memorable on this one either. What's the most interesting to me is that all of a sudden Derek sounds like Dez from Devil Driver on this album. I was honestly looking at the info to double check that it wasn't him in some places, and it's not, but it ends up feeling kind of like a mid-tier Devil Driver album as a result. So this one landed at good. I think it's a little better than these two, but yeah, it's not in my favorites. Then we have The Mediator, Between Head and Hands Must Be the Heart in 2013. This one is based on the 1927 film Metropolis, largely a continuation of the sound from that last album. It opens up on a very grindy note with Trauma of War, but then mixes things up with a lot of slower and mid-paced tracks. The Vatican is a banger, great riffs and tribal drumming on Manipulation of Tragedy. Love the chugging Impending Doom, and both the Bliss of Ignorance and the Age of the Atheist goes pretty damn hard. Notably, Dave Lombardo plays drums on Obsessed, too. I'm not a big fan of Grief, which has some cool ideas, but I don't think they're executed that well. I didn't care for this one at first. It has grown on me though, and it's another one that I think is at least more interesting. So it's going to good tier. Then we got Machine Messiah in 2017. What happened to me? Felt like I had everything. Such a big catastrophe. This was their longest gap between albums, and then they bring it back though with this big dramatic opener with the title track. I feel like they outdo this one in every way with the next album, but we'll get to that. Phantom Self reminds me again of Devil Driver, specifically I Dreamed I Died, but mixed with some Machine Head and some cool strings. Iceberg Dances is an interesting detour going full on instrumental prog, complete with Hammond organ. It sounds very Rush inspired, and then leading into the string intro of the epic Sworn Oath. Aletheia mixes tribal elements with this kind of weird and uncanny atmosphere, stellar drumming on Silent Violence, and dizzying guitar shredding on Vandal's Nest. It's a little inconsistent and seems a little confused about what direction it wants to go, but I've come to like this one quite a bit too, so I am also putting this one at good, maybe even a little bit higher than the last one. And then we have Quadra in 2020. Isolation is the type of opener I was talking about. Better way to put your best foot forward with those glorious strings and then just a total ripper of a track. I also really like the infectious grooves of Means to an End, and Capital Enslavement is both a total headbanger and showcases even better integration of the little string hook. More great tribal drumming across the board and catchy groove on Autumn. The Pentagram is just pure shred on par with most modern thrash metal albums. And then they step up the drama even more on the incredible Guardians of the Earth and Agony of Defeat, the latter of which has these chorals as well as some very Led Zeppelin kind of cashmere sounding strings. Epic in every sense of the word. This is arguably the strongest Derek era album start to finish, and I love that it's going to stand as their grand farewell to the fans. It is going to great tier. Y'all check out this playlist for more thrash and groove metal rankings. I believe there's even Soulfly in that playlist. And again, let me know down below, how would you rank these albums differently? Let's get a discussion going. My opinion is just my opinion, only that. Stay mad if you're mad, though. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the trenches.